The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was blessed with many miracles, and the Isra and Mi'raj was one of the most significant events of his life, where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was taken to Masjid Al Aqsa and then travelled up through the heavens and far beyond to speak with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. As Jibrahil was only allowed to go up to a certain area, and the revelations are sent through Jibrahil. But here, after a certain point, Jibrahil was told that he can't go forward, he can't continue. Only the Prophet ﷺ was allowed to proceed. The Isra is part of the journey from Makkah to Masjid Al Aqsa, and the journey from Masjid Al Aqsa to the heavens is called the Mi'raj, and this is why it's called the Isra wal Mi'raj. The miracle of Isra is mentioned clear-cut in the Quran. No one can actually deny this. It's in Surah 17. So this event took place, it came at a time when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was deeply distressed. He was at his lowest. He had just lost his uncle Abu Talib and his beloved wife Khadija radhiyallahu ta'ala anha. And those who have studied the seerah, who are aware of the life of the Prophet, will know how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had been through so much from the very moment he was born. So before his birth, he lost his father. Then at the age of 5-6, he lost his mother and his grandfather. And then he had to bury his own sons with his very own hands. And then the Makkans, the pagans, continuously, slandering him and labeling him as dishonest and fraud and, unstable. And what was extremely painful is that the slandering came from the very people who knew of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who the Prophet was actually raised amongst. So they knew of him, yet they not only denied that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came with the truth, but they had this distaste and this distrust and hatred towards the messenger, but also the word of Allah. And they just did not believe in the prophethood at all, and they just did not tolerate the Prophet being there anymore. So when the Makkans refused to believe and accept the Prophet's teachings, the Prophet then headed out to the people of Taif, and there he actually expected them to be a bit more welcoming, and he expected them to listen to the message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. But instead, there was like a crowd of people who just gave him like rocks and boulders and pelted him with stones and rocks, to the point where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was so injured that he had to walk out of Taif. Okay, so they abused him so much that his whole body was bleeding, to the extent where the blood was on his feet and his feet were stuck onto his sandals. That's how much blood he had on his body. And he had to leave Taif, and he was given shelter, like he was invited by a Christian who gave him refuge and sat him under a tree and gave him something to eat and drink. And then at this point, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made a beautiful dua. And after the Prophet made this dua, it was as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responded immediately by saying that if no one wants you, if no one loves you, then come up to the heavens and see what your honor, what your worth, and what your place is. So it was that year of Isra wal Mi'raj when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened up him a gateway out of this worldly life into the upper heavens. And then Jibrahil alayhi salam descends to the Prophet, and before they set out on the journey, Jibrahil operates on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam by opening his chest, washing his heart with Zamzam, and cleansing the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's heart, and and adding in their iman and wisdom, hikmah, and illuminating his heart. And then it is after being cleansed, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is then summoned by Jibrahil alayhi salam to Buraq. Now the Buraq was able to travel at great speed, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the hadith describes this and says that the length of one of the Buraq's strides was the same distance as far as the eye could see. So then when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ arrives in Bayt al-Muqaddas, Jibrahil orders the Prophet to then tie the Buraq with the ring that all the previous prophets used to tie their animals with. And then in Bayt al-Muqaddas, Masjid Al Aqsa, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ leads the prayers to all the previous prophets who came before him. So Adam alayhi salam, Isa, Yahya, Harun, Idris, Musa and Ibrahim alayhi salam, etc. And after leading the prayers, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ then ascends to the heavens.